All right, everybody, buckle up. Because you sent us down a rabbit hole with this deep dive. We're talking Stan Romanek, a guy who's basically synonymous with UFOs, right?
He really is. And the thing about the Romanek case, it always pulls you in because it's not just about whether aliens exist. It makes you think about how we decide what's true, especially about really crazy stuff.
That's what's so wild about this.
Mm.
We're working with interview snippets, what the psychologists had to say, even a physicist's take on this guy. But this isn't just about spaceships, is it? It feels way bigger, like exploring how we get our heads around anything life throws at us.
You got it. Romanek's story, it's like a launch pad to understanding belief, how we see evidence, even just the human need to make sense of things that seem impossible.
Okay, so where do we even start with someone who's like, won the alien encounter lottery or something?
Let's go back all the way back to Romanek's first big UFO sighting. It was back in 2000, and things escalated quickly. More sightings than these strange encounters, even claims of being abducted, and not just once.
Oh yeah, and that backyard UFO video, the one that
Oh.
blew up online. It's grainy as heck, but still creepy. And then there's that photo, the one from a party where the little girl just vanishes.
Those abduction stories are something else. He goes into detail about being inside a spaceship, actually interacting with these beings, and even getting messages from them.
Wait, messages, as in, take me to your leader.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of messages are we even talking about?
Romanek says they gave him messages about humanity's future, especially how crucial it is to take care of the environment. The wild part is how often these exact themes show up in other people's stories about contact, which maybe we can get into later.
So are these beings like cosmic climate activists or something? That feels like a common thing with UFO stories, right? They're here to warn us about ourselves.
It really makes you wonder if it's more about us projecting our worries onto the unknown. Like, are we looking for answers out there because we can't find them down here?
Right. Like maybe we want to believe that someone, even if they're from another galaxy, has it all figured out.
And that's why we've got to be a little skeptical with these kinds of claims.
Yeah.
Belief, it's powerful stuff. It can mess with your judgment, especially when you're talking about something as huge as alien contact.
Speaking of judgment, we've got those psychologists who actually analyzed Romanek. What do they make of him?
They noticed some interesting things, like his stress levels were through the roof, which actually fits with someone who's been through a really traumatic event. And he totally believed that what happened to him was real, not hallucinations, not made up.
Didn't one of them actually say they thought he wasn't lying?
Yeah, they did. But this is where it gets tricky. Just because someone believes something deeply doesn't mean it's true. How we see things, it's affected by so many things, like stress, what we've been through, even what we already believe.
So you're saying sincerity isn't proof on its own? Makes you wonder how much of what we see, even in normal life, is just us looking through our own filters.
Exactly. Which brings us to one of the weirdest parts of the Romanek case, the downloaded equations story. So Romanek claims that during one encounter, these beings downloaded, like literally put into his brain, complex math equations. A physicist, Claude Swanson, took a look at them and was really thrown off.
Hold on. Downloaded equations. Straight into his head. What did this Swanson guy say about them?
Swanson, he's a respected physicist, and he said these equations seem to be about advanced physics concepts. We're talking faster than light travel, messing with space-time things way beyond anything Romanek should know about. Even Swanson had to admit that something unexplained might be going on.
Whoa, even for a skeptic, that's pretty wild. What are we supposed to do with that kind of detail?
Here's where the messenger story comes in. It's this idea that some people, maybe like Romanek, are like channels for information from something way smarter than us. They're not making it up, but they're not totally in control either.
Like he's picking up some cosmic radio frequency no one else can hear.
It's a cool idea, right? It changes how we think about whether Romanek's telling the truth. He might believe every word he says, even if where it's coming from is totally beyond what we understand now.
That is seriously mind-blowing. But we'd be doing a disservice if we didn't mention the other big thing with Romanek. In 2014, he got into legal trouble, charges related to child pornography.
Yeah, that was a dark turn, and really serious. It definitely makes people question his credibility.
It throws a wrench in everything. On the one hand, those are incredibly serious accusations, but on the other, does that mean everything he ever said about his other experiences is automatically false?
It really complicates things. Does what happened make his UFO stories less believable? Or could it even be, and this is just a thought, that someone who wanted to discredit him targeted him that way on purpose? There's a lot to unpack there.
It really makes you think. This is a story with layers upon layers. So where do we even go from here? What are we taking away from all this?
To me, the most important thing isn't figuring out if Romanek is telling the truth or not. It's about realizing how complex we are as humans, how much belief shapes our reality, and how hard it is to deal with claims that change everything we thought we knew about the world.
Wow. Okay, you've given us a lot to digest already. This is heavy stuff. But before we go further, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to circle back to those downloaded equations and what they might actually mean. Stick with us. Okay, we're back, and I gotta say, those downloaded equations are still messing with me. It's like something straight out of a movie.
It's definitely one of the things people get hung up on with the Romanek case. You've got these crazy complex equations, stuff that seems to break the laws of physics as we know them. But then you've got Romanek himself, a guy with a history of making these wild claims.
And we can't forget about the legal trouble he got into later. It makes it so hard to know what to believe, especially when you're dealing with something this far out there.
No doubt. It reminds you that the truth is hardly ever neat and tidy, and when you throw in the possibility of aliens, well, things get messy fast.
No kidding. So how do we even begin to wrap our heads around this? Do we just chuck the equations out the window because of what happened with Romanek? Or is there room to keep an open mind, even when it's tough?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I think it comes down to this. We can acknowledge that the situation is complex without just dismissing the possibility that something really strange happened.
Right, like maybe, just maybe, there's some truth hidden in all the noise.
Exactly. That's why I'm drawn to that messenger theory. It gives us a way to understand how someone like Romanek, even with everything else going on, could be a channel for information that just seems impossible based on what we know.
Like he's tuned into something beyond our understanding.
Yeah, something that challenges how we see reality, our place in the universe, maybe even what humans are capable of.
Whoa. Okay, you blew my mind again. But while we're on the subject of what Romanek claims, there's another part of this that's really interesting to me, the timing of it all.
You're right. We can't forget that Romanek's story blew up in the early 2000s, a time when the world felt really uncertain, when people were losing trust in the powers that be. Think about it, 9/11 had just happened, we were at war, and everyone was anxious about the future.
The world felt upside down.
Exactly. And in that environment, conspiracy theories were everywhere. People wanted answers, something more than the official story. Romanek, with his claims about government cover-ups and hidden truths, he tapped into that desire for something bigger, something beyond the everyday.
It's like his story gave people hope, something bigger than themselves, in a world that felt chaotic.
And we can't underestimate how much technology played a part in all this. Romanek was one of the first to really use video evidence in a way that captured people's imaginations.
Right. That grainy video from his backyard, it felt real, relatable, like something anyone with a camcorder could have filmed. It made UFOs feel less like science fiction and more like they could be real.
Exactly. That feeling that anyone could find evidence of the unknown, it fueled people's interest in UFOs and alien encounters.
Although it also opened the door for hoaxes and people copying him, which just made things more confusing.
Absolutely. And that brings up a really important point. We need to be skeptical, to think critically. It's important to be open to the possibility of extraordinary things, but we also need to be careful and use good judgment.
So how do we balance that? How do we stay open-minded without believing every crazy story or getting lost in all the misinformation?
It's a tough balance. We've got to ask hard questions, look closely at the evidence, and be willing to have our assumptions challenged.
Like being a detective trying to sort out the facts from the fiction.
Exactly. And sometimes the most interesting discoveries come from asking, what if?
Speaking of what ifs and questioning what we think we know, there's something else in the material you gave me that jumped out at me. Apparently, Romanek had a learning disability, dyslexia.
Yeah, and it talks about how that affected him, his self-esteem, even how some people saw him as credible.
It made me wonder, how often do we dismiss incredible stories just because they come from unexpected sources? From people who don't fit our idea of who should be believable?
That's a great point. We connect credibility with things like education, jobs, even how well someone speaks. But what if those things sometimes stop us from seeing other ways of knowing, other ways of experiencing the world?
What if the things that make someone different, that make them an outsider, are the same things that make them more open to experiences outside of what we consider normal?
It's a fascinating idea, right? It reminds us to check our biases, to listen to these stories with an open mind, and to remember that the truth can show up in the most unexpected ways.
Okay, now those are some things to think about. But before we dive into what Romanek says these beings actually look like, which is super interesting. Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more on the Stan Romanek story, so don't go anywhere.
Okay, so we're back, and I've got to know, what did Romanek say these beings actually look like? Were they like the classic grays or something even weirder?
He actually describes a real mix. Some sound like the stereotypical gray alien, the big heads, those huge black eyes, small and thin bodies.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty standard for these kinds of stories, but it doesn't stay that way, right?
You could say that. Romanek also talks about seeing beings that are way more unusual. He even describes some that were childlike, with blonde hair and these really intense eyes.
Hold on, childlike aliens. Now, that's not something you hear every day. That's more like, I don't know, close encounters, not your average alien abduction story.
Exactly. It suggests a totally different kind of encounter, right? Less about being experimented on and more about, I don't know, some kind of connection between species, maybe even something almost familial. It really throws a wrench in that whole idea of they're just here to study us. So if they aren't abducting people for science experiments, what does Romanek say they actually want?
Well, remember the messenger idea we were talking about? A big part of his stories is that these beings are worried about what's going to happen to humanity, especially how we're treating the environment.
Right, the cosmic environmentalists.
Yeah.
But if they're so advanced, why not just, fix it themselves? Beam down and clean up the oceans or whatever.
That's the big question, isn't it? And Romanek says these beings told him they can't interfere directly. There's some kind of cosmic rule against it.
So they can abduct him in the blink of an eye, but actually helping with climate change is a bridge too far.
It seems like a contradiction, right? But then again, we're talking about beings with a completely different understanding of the universe. Who knows what interference means to them?
Good point. This whole thing really makes you rethink everything.
That's the thing. It makes you question. And I think that's what makes stories like Romanek's so fascinating. They make us confront how little we actually know, wrap our heads around ideas we don't have answers for, and consider that maybe, just maybe, our reality is just one tiny part of a much bigger, stranger universe.
It's exciting and scary at the same time. But hey, I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Stan Romanek. We've covered his claims of seeing UFOs, interacting with aliens, even those wild downloaded equations. We looked at what evidence there is or isn't, and thought about the psychological and cultural factors that might be influencing things.
We've gone through a story full of contradictions, unanswered questions, and honestly, more than a few moments that left us scratching our heads.
And I think along the way, we've stumbled onto something really profound. How much we need to understand where we fit into the grand scheme of things, and that human desire to know if we're alone out here.
That curiosity, it drives our dreams, our fears, our never-ending fascination with the unknown.
It's been a wild ride. If you're as intrigued by this as we are and you want to go deeper, we've got links to some of the material we use in the show notes. And until next time, keep those minds open and don't ever stop asking the big questions.
Thanks for being here. Catch you on the next deep dive.